You're not even half the woman my mother is. Burp. That's what my daughter-in-law Megan said to me, in front of everyone at my own dining table, with her fork still in her hand and my son sitting right beside her. The sound of her voice sliced through the air sharper than the knife I was using to cut the roast chicken. I remember the way her eyes looked that night, calm, deliberate, as if she'd been waiting for that moment. The room went quiet. The ticking of the old wall clock behind her suddenly felt louder than ever. My son, Daniel, didn't even look at me. He just stared down at his plate, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Abra, for a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard, maybe she meant something, maybe it was a joke, but the smirk on her face told me otherwise. I pushed my chair back slowly, my hands trembling just enough to make the silverware clink. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I just looked at her. This woman my son had chosen, the one I'd welcomed into my home, my family. And I said softly, "Excuse me? Excuse me?" She repeated it, word for word, louder this time. "You're not even half the woman my mother is." Abra, and right then, something inside me shifted. Before all this, before Megan, before that night, my life had been peaceful in a quiet, middle-aged kind of way. I lived in a small town outside Nashville, Tennessee. My husband George had passed away 6 years earlier from a heart condition, and after that it was just me and my little home. A modest, 2-bedroom cottage with pale yellow siding and a porch swing that creaked when the wind was right. Every Sunday morning I'd wake up before the sun, brew my favorite hazelnut coffee, and watch the mist rise from the fields behind the house. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And peace, real peace, felt like something sacred. Danbury Daniel was my only son. He'd always been quiet like his father, thoughtful, careful, a little slow to speak but kind in his heart. After George's death, it was Daniel who'd check in every ride to make her feel welcome. I'd invite them over for dinner once a week, ask about her work, compliment her cooking when she brought dishes for Thanksgiving. But slowly, I started noticing small things. Abra, she never said thank you when I helped. If Daniel complimented my film, "It's a little salty, don't you think?" she'd say with that same perfect smile. Still, I told myself not to take it personally. Maybe she was just nervous around me. Maybe she wanted to prove herself. I'd been a daughter-in-law once, too. I knew it wasn't easy. Then came the wedding. She planned everything, down to the color of the napkins and the playlist for the reception. When I offered to help, she told me, "Oh, don't worry, my mom's handling it." Her mother, Patricia, was indeed handling it. I met her the day before the ceremony, tall, polished, with silver hair that gleamed like she'd stepped out of a magazine. She spoke with a tone that managed to sound both polite and superior. "Abra at tea," he reception. I sat quietly at my assigned table while Megan and Patricia took turns posing for photos with my son. Every time I caught Daniel's eye, he'd smile faintly, but I could see the exhaustion in it, the kind that comes from trying to keep two women happy at once. I told myself this was just the start. Every family needs time to find its rhythm. I could be patient, I could be understanding. Abra and I was, for a long time. After the wedding, they moved into a house about 20 minutes from me. I didn't visit often, didn't want to intrude, but when I did, I noticed that Daniel seemed quieter, like he was walking on eggshells. Megan would correct him in the smallest things. "Daniel, you forgot to take your shoes off." Daniel, don't leave the dishes like that." Breaking Mom's way of cooking. Your mom's way of cooking might have worked then. This is how we do things now. That last one hurt, more than I wanted to admit. Still, I smiled. I nodded. I told myself it's not worth a fight, Abra even defay. Deed her to my friends. She's just strong-willed, I'd say. Modern, independent. That's how young women are these days. At that night, the night she told me I wasn't half the woman her mother was, that was the first time I saw how deep her disrespect ran. Abra. It wasn't just about me. It was about Daniel, about the quiet way he sat there and said nothing. Eber. After dinner, when they left, I cleared the table alone. My hands shook as I picked up the plates. I didn't cry, not yet. I just stood there, staring at the two empty chairs at the end of the table, hers and his. He and I knew something had changed, something I couldn't ignore anymore. The next morning, I woke up to find my phone buzzing on the nightstand. On the nightstand, it was Daniel. Daniel. His voice was low, tired. Mom, about last night. I held my breath. Maybe he'd apologize for Megan's words. Maybe he'd explain. But instead he sighed and said, "Could you not take what Megan said too seriously? She didn't mean it like that." I swallowed hard, staring at the sunlight creeping across my bedroom wall. "Daniel," I said quietly. She looked me straight in the eye when she said it. He didn't respond right away. I could hear traffic in the background, the faint honk of cars. He was probably driving to work. Finally, he said, "Mom, she's under a lot of stress. Work's been rough, and she's been helping her mom with some things. She didn't mean it that way." I wanted to believe him. Believe him. I really did. Really did. Say, "All right." I said, finally, "If you say so." But we hung up. But after we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while. The quiet felt heavy. I kept hearing her voice replaying in my head. You're not even half the woman my mother is." There was something about the way she'd said it. Not in anger, but in certainty. Over the next few weeks, Daniel came by less often. He used to stop in every Friday after work, sometimes with a bag of groceries or a new movie for us to watch. But lately, his visits became shorter, rushed, distracted. One evening, I decided to bake his favorite, peach cobbler. I hadn't made it in months. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the kitchen, and for the first time in a while I felt a spark of warmth. I called him. "Sweetheart, why don't you and Megan come over?" There was a pause. Then he said, I don't think we can tonight. Megan's mom's coming over for dinner." "Oh," I said, keeping my voice light. "All right, maybe next time." After we hung up, I looked at the cobbler cooling on the counter, golden brown, bubbling around the edges. My eyes burned. My eyes burned. Broke. A few days later, I ran into Megan's mother, Patricia, at the grocery store. She was standing in the produce section, inspecting avocados like they were diamonds. "Oh, Mrs. Collins," she said when she noticed me. "How lovely to see you." Her tone was polite, but there was that undertone, the kind that said we're not quite equals. "Nice to see you too," I replied. She smiled thinly. "Megan told me you're quite the cook." I told her she should take notes. I suppose Daniel's lucky to have two women taking care of him. I blinked. "Taking care of him?" "Oh, you know," she said with a little laugh. "I make sure Megan keeps things in line. A good marriage needs structure. My late husband always said, a man behaves better when he knows who's in charge." I didn't respond. I just nodded, though inside something twisted. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in my mind. I make sure Megan keeps things in line. What did that mean exactly? The next clue came a week later, when Daniel stopped by after work. Alone this time. He looked exhausted. His tie was loose, and his eyes had that hollow, restless look people get when they're not sleeping well. "Everything okay?" I asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. He hesitated. "Yeah, just busy." His voice lacked conviction. What his voice lacked conviction. We sat at the table, the same one where Megan had humiliated me before. I wanted to ask, "Are you happy?" Is she treating you right? But I didn't. I knew he'd only defend her. Instead, I said gently, "You've lost weight." Yibru chuckled weakly. "Megan's on this new health kick. No carbs, no sugar. She says it's good for me." "Abreu," I smiled faintly. "You always did love your carbs." Brr, for a moment. For a moment we shared a quiet laugh. A tiny piece of our old flawed bond flickering back to life. But just as quickly it faded. His phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen, and I saw her name light up. His shoulders stiffened. "Kibri, you should answer." "You should answer," I said softly. "Ishid Azri." He nodded, standing up. He walked into the living room to take the call. From where I sat, I could hear her voice faintly through the receiver. Sharp, quick, questioning. "Where are you?" "Abri, Kralangher about Sunday." "How long are you staying?" Habra you." "Did you remind her about Sunday?" Britoing her tone wasn't that of a wife calling her husband. It was more like a supervisor checking up on an employee. When he came back, his expression was tense. "Burker, Mom." He said carefully, "Megan wanted me to remind you about Sunday. We're hosting a little brunch for her mom's birthday. She thought it might be nice if you came." I smiled politely. "That's thoughtful of her." But deep down, something told me it wasn't an invitation. It was a test. That Sunday, I dressed in my soft blue cardigan, the one Daniel always said brought out my eyes. I brought a box of homemade lemon bars. Abrer. When I arrived at their house, the first thing I noticed was how different it felt. The air smelled like perfume and disinfectant. Everything looked staged, like a model home, not a place where people lived. Megan opened the door. "Oh, Mrs. Collins," she said, smiling tightly. "You made it. How lovely." "Aber," I handed her the box. "Just something sweet for the table." She glanced at it, then handed it off to someone else without looking inside. In the dining room, Patricia sat at the head of the table, laughing with a glass of white wine in hand. When she saw me, she raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the other mother." Everyone laughed politely. Throughout the brunch, I watched as Megan and Patricia controlled every conversation. Daniel barely spoke. Every time he did, one of them interrupted him, correcting, teasing, steering him back into silence. At one point, Patricia said with a smirk, "Megan tells me Daniel was quite the mama's boy growing up. You must have had trouble letting him go." "Brr," I smiled calmly. "Not trouble, just love." She sipped her wine. "Well, I suppose every man needs to grow up eventually." "Ibru," I looked at Daniel. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw something there, shame, or maybe apology. When I left that afternoon, I knew something for certain. Megan didn't just dislike me, she wanted me out of his life, and she wasn't alone. Abrahi, her mother, was right there helping her do it. 2 weeks after that uncomfortable brunch, I woke up to a knock at my front door. It was early, around 7:30, and the morning air still had that quiet silver chill. I slipped on my robe and opened the door, expecting maybe the mailman or a neighbor. But it was Daniel. He stood there with dark circles under his eyes and a manila folder tucked under his arm. Eber said, "Daniel," I said, surprised. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, like he was deciding whether to come inside or turn around and pretend this visit never happened. "Mom," he said finally, his voice breaking slightly, "can I stay for a bit?" "Bruh." "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "You don't even have to ask." He walked in, sat down at the kitchen table, and rubbed his temples. I poured him some coffee the way I always did, but his hands trembled when he took the cup. "Megan and I, we had a fight," he said. Brr. My heart sank. "About what?" "Shibra?" He hesitated. He hesitated. About you. That word, you, hung in the air like a stone dropped in still water. Heber, what about me? I asked softly. He let out a bitter laugh. Apparently I'm still too close to my mother. Apparently you're controlling. And old-fashioned. And you make her feel judged. She said her mom would never tolerate someone like you in the family. Abru. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. And what did you say? He looked down. I told her that wasn't fair, that you've always been respectful to her, but she wouldn't stop. It turned into a screaming match. Ibro, I sat quietly, my heart aching for him. Daniel always talked about me that way? He didn't answer, that the silence was enough. Then he pushed the manila folder across the table. She's been talking to her mother about selling the house. Bombri, bro, I frowned. Selling your house? He nodded. Patricia's been encouraging her to list it. Says it's too small, too outdated. But here's the thing, Mom. Megan's name is on the deed. Mine. Deed. Mine isn't. Brr, I blinked. What? How? Brr. She said she'd handle the paperwork when we bought it. Said it would be easier for her job's tax stuff. I trusted her. Brr, my stomach dropped. Daniel, I whispered, do you understand? And what that means? He nodded, his voice cracking. If she sells it, there's nothing I can do. My name's not on a thing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked on the wall. The coffee steam rose and disappeared between us. She said she wants to move closer to her mom, he added quietly. Leave my son's marriage was beyond saving. I prayed about it every night. I even called Daniel once to say, maybe it's just a phase. Maybe you two need space. Hebrewer, but he just sounded hollow. Mom, I don't know anymore. Then one afternoon, I decided to drive over to their house. I told myself it was just to drop off some mail that had accidentally come to my address. But deep down, I think I was searching for something. Some proof that things weren't as bad as I feared. When I pulled into their driveway, I noticed something strange. Patricia's car, that sleek silver Lexus, was parked right in front of the garage. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. Still, I heard voices from inside. Reverie. Megan, you can't just do this without telling him, Patricia's voice said sharply. Mom, I've waited long enough. He'll understand eventually. No, he won't. He's too soft, just like his mother. You need to make him believe it's his decision. My breath caught. I stepped back from the door, my heart racing. I shouldn't have been there, I knew that. But I couldn't move. Megan's voice came next, cold and deliberate. Once the house is sold, I'll tell him we're using the money to start fresh in Atlanta, and when we do, I'll make sure his mother has no reason to visit. Patricia chuckled lightly. You're learning, sweetheart. My vision blurred. I stumbled back to my car and drove away, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I sat in the driveway for a long while, staring at the porch light flickering against the twilight. I felt something inside me collapse, not just anger, but grief. They weren't just pushing me out of his life. They were trying to erase me from it. That night, I called Daniel. I didn't tell him what I'd overheard, not yet. I just asked if he was home. He said no, he was working late. I hesitated. Then I asked quietly, do you trust Megan? He was silent for a long moment. I used to. Then be careful, I said. Please, just be careful. He didn't ask why. He just said, okay, Mom, in that tired, defeated voice that broke my heart. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room and let the tears finally come. Be-brewery, not just for me, but for my son, for the boy I raised to be kind and trusting, who'd married a woman who saw those qualities as weaknesses, for the man who couldn't see that love, real love, doesn't require destruction. A few days later, I got a call from a mutual friend, someone from Daniel's office. "Abra, did you hear?" she said, her tone hesitant. "Daniel put in his resignation." "That, Abra." I froze. What? What? Abra say told his boss he's moving to Atlanta. Greg. A say when. End of the month. Abra thanked her and hung up, my heart pounding. So it was true. Megan had convinced him they were leaving. Ebru, and once they did, I knew I'd lose him completely. That night I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where this all began, and made a decision. If Megan and Patricia were determined to erase me, I would show them just how wrong they were about what kind of woman I am. I wasn't going to scream or beg. Brie, but I wasn't going to let them destroy my son's life either. Brie. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, in that same old wooden chair, staring at the quiet hum of the refrigerator light. Every tick of the clock sounded like a countdown. Burke. I thought about every word I'd overheard at that house, the way Patricia's voice had dripped with satisfaction, the way Megan had said, "Once the house is sold." Like my son's home, his memories, his life, were just items on a checklist. No, I couldn't let them win. Ebery. But I also knew one thing for sure. If I came at them directly, they'd twist everything. Women like Patricia had a gift for turning truth into manipulation. I had to be smart. Quiet. So I started with the papers. A few days later, when Daniel came by to pick up some of his old boxes from the garage, I made sure to ask casually, "Sweetheart, do you happen to know where the house documents are kept?" "Brie," he shrugged. "Megan keeps all that stuff in her office." Stuff in her office. "Oh," I said, feigning innocence. "Do you have copies?" He shook his head. "No. She said she'd handle everything." That hurt. How easily he'd trusted her. But I smiled and said, "All right, dear, I was just curious." When he left, I called a friend of mine, Sandra, who worked as a notary at a local law office. She'd known Daniel since he was a baby. Sandra," I said quietly, hypothetically. If a house was purchased under one spouse's name, could the other be completely cut out of it? She hesitated. Technically, yes. If the other person didn't sign anything, they'd have no legal claim. But if funds were shared, like joint savings, there might be recourse. Why? What's going on, Linda? I paused. Let's just say my son might be standing on shaky ground. She sighed. Then tell him to gather every receipt, every transfer, every check he ever wrote for that house. If he can prove contribution, he's not powerless. Her words gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. That weekend, I invited Daniel over for dinner. Just him. I made meatloaf, his favorite from childhood, and halfway through the meal I asked softly, "Daniel, do you remember who paid for the down payment on your house?" He frowned. "We both did, I think. I transferred some money from my savings and she added the rest. Do you still have the bank records?" He gave me a puzzled look. "Why are you asking?" "Because, sweetheart," I said carefully, "sometimes love makes us trust too easily. You might need those records one day." He sighed but nodded. "All right, I'll look for them." Then, after a long pause, he said something that nearly broke me. "Mom, I don't even recognize my marriage anymore. I feel like I'm living in her mother's shadow. Everything we do, every decision, Patricia has to approve it. And if I ever disagree, Megan says I'm being disrespectful." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Daniel, love doesn't silence you. It doesn't erase who you are." He looked down, eyes glassy. "I don't know what to do." To Dan, I saw one, but real. 2 days later, I drove to the county clerk's office. I told them I was helping my son with property research. The woman behind the counter, kind, middle-aged, with reading glasses perched low on her nose, asked for the address. A few minutes later, she printed a copy of the deed. Burke. When she handed it to me, my heart sank. It was just as Daniel said. Sole owner, but then something caught my eye. The date of purchase, the signature line. A. Brewer. I recognized the handwriting in the witness section. Patricia Langston. Her mother had signed as a witness. It wasn't illegal, but it was calculated. It meant they'd planned this together from the start. I folded the paper carefully, slipped it into my purse, and walked out into the Tennessee sun with a company. LD calm settling in my chest. Burke. They wanted to erase me quietly. Burke. I would expose them just as quietly. The next weekend, Megan called me. Her tone was sugar-sweet, like someone rehearsing for a role. Keyburr. "Hi, Mrs. Collins. I wanted to let you know we'll be hosting a little goodbye dinner before we move. You're welcome to come, if you'd like." Brr, if you'd like. If you'd like. Brie. I could hear Patricia's phrasing in her voice. Brie. I smiled into the phone. "Phone, of course, dear. I wouldn't miss it." When I hung up, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The night of the dinner, I arrived early, wearing my late husband's favorite blue shawl. I brought a pie, as always. When I stepped inside, everything looked perfect. Too perfect. The dining table gleamed under soft yellow lights. The air smelled like rosemary and lemon, and Patricia stood near the fireplace laughing. In that polite way of hers. Brie. "Ah, Linda," she said when she saw me. "You made it? How nice." Of course, I replied warmly. "Wouldn't want to miss cheesh. A farewell." As the night went on, I played my part. I smiled. I listened. I even laughed at their little stories. But inside, I was waiting for the right moment. Burger. It came when Megan stood to make a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. "To family, to growth, and to leaving behind old habits." Fee. Her eyes flicked toward me as she said that last part. I stood too, slowly. "To truth," I said softly, lifting my glass. A few polite laughs, but Megan's smile faltered. "Speaking of truth," I continued, setting my glass down, "I found something interesting at the county office." Her eyes widened slightly. "Excuse me?" "The deed to this house," I said, pulling the folded paper from my purse, "and your mother's name as witness. Funny, worse. It's rare for family members to do that. Almost like there was a plan." Patricia's expression hardened. "Linda, I think this is the place." "Oh, I think it is," I interrupted gently, "because I also know Daniel's funds were used for the down payment, which means legally this house isn't as one-sided as you might have hoped." The room fell silent. Daniel looked from me to Megan, confusion dawning in his eyes. "What is she talking about?" Burr. Megan's mouth opened, then closed. "Daniel, it's not what... She's been planning to sell this house and move to Atlanta, without you. I heard her tell her mother herself." Patricia stood abruptly. You have no proof. Yibra, I looked right at her. I was standing outside your daughter's front door. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Abrahi Daniel's face went pale. He set his glass down, his voice barely a whisper. You were going to sell the house? Megan's composure Crozier cracked. Daniel, please. Ibri, but he stepped back, shaking his head. You were going to move without even telling me? And just like that, the facade shattered. Patricia tried to speak, but Daniel cut her off. I think it's time you both left. Bro, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat quietly, watching the truth settle like dust after a storm. When they finally left the room, Daniel sank into the nearest chair, his hands covering his face, and for the first time in months, I reached over and touched his shoulder. Abru. I told you to be careful, I whispered. He nodded slowly. You were right, Mom. Ibru, when word spread about what happened that night, it didn't come from me. It came from Daniel. Kibrik. He showed up at our Sunday church the following week, his face pale, his hands trembling as he stood before the congregation after service ended. People shifted in their seats, whispering softly. I could tell most of them had heard bits and pieces. Stories have a way of finding their own wings. He cleared his throat and said, I need to apologize to someone. Someone I hurt. The room fell silent. I sat near the back, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Ibri, he looked straight at me. Ibri shed, my mother, he said. For forgetting who raised me, for letting pride and love blind me, and for standing by while someone disrespect. Ted her in her own home. I felt my throat tighten. A few people gasped softly. He continued, I thought I was being sides, but I was being a weak son. I let speak louder than my mother's love. Ibra, there were tears in his eyes now, real ones, not the kind that come from guilt, but the kind that come from seeing clearly after a long darkness. Ibra Grace wasn't there. She had moved back to her mother's house 2 days after the dinner. She left Daniel a note, short and cold, Ibra. Said, live where I'm not worshipped. I'm yet worshipped. Worshipped. Stayed with me for days. It said more than any argument could have. Ibra, after church, people came to me quietly. Some hugged me. Others just nodded, their eyes soft with understanding. You see, small towns remember everything. Who cooked the best pie, who helped who when the storm came, and who forgot their roots. Ibra, but they also forgive. Eventually. Later that evening, Daniel came by the house again. This time he didn't knock timidly. He opened the door like he used to when he was a boy, when he'd come home from school yelling, Mom, I'm starving. Ibru. He didn't bring flowers or apologies, just groceries, a bag full of them. He set them on the counter like an offering. Ibru, I thought maybe we could cook dinner, he said softly. I looked at him for a long time. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked older somehow, like the past few weeks had carved something out of him. I didn't say yes right away. Instead, I took the tomatoes from the bag and started washing them under the sink. The sound of running water filled the silence. Finally, I said, You remember how to make my lasagna recipe? Bro, he smiled, just barely. Layer by layer, he whispered, and that's how healing began. Not with big speeches, not with tears, but with the smell of garlic and basil, the sound of bubbling sauce, and the rhythm of two people chopping vegetables side by side after too long apart. As we cooked, Daniel Elked really talked. He told me how Grace had always compared herself to others, how her mother made her feel like she had to be the best at everything. And when she wasn't, the people closest to her. I listened quietly. I listened quietly. I didn't defend myself, and I didn't condemn her either, because at that moment I realized hurt people hurt others, and sometimes we become collateral damage in someone else's war with themselves. After dinner, Daniel sat at the table, the same one where it all fell apart weeks ago. The candlelight flickered softly between us. Mom, he said quietly, I can't undo what she said to you, or how long I let it happen. But I can make sure you never feel disrespected in your own home again. I reached across the table and took his hand. It felt like holding the hand of my little boy again, the one who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, before life taught him to hide his pain behind pride. I know, son, I said, and I forgive you. A long she exhaled, a long, shaky breath that seemed to release everything he'd been carrying. Outside, the evening air was soft and golden. For the first time in months, I opened the kitchen window. The scent of honeysuckle drifted in, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a lawnmower and children laughing. Life, steady and ordinary, moving forward. In the following weeks, Daniel came over often, sometimes to fix a leaky pipe, sometimes just to sit quietly. He started taking care of himself again. I could see the man he once was returning in small ways. The way he laughed, the way he noticed details again. Grace didn't come back. I heard her. I heard through a mutual friend that she'd taken a job in another state, and while that could have been a source of gossip or bitterness, I felt only relief. Not because I wished her ill, but because sometimes distance is the only way peace can survive. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he said, "You know, Mom, I used to think strength was about standing your ground, but maybe it's also about knowing when to kneel and say sorry." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, I smiled without forcing it. "Strength," I said, "isn't loud, son. It's quiet. It's the way you hold yourself when no one's clapping. It's how you choose not to become what hurts you." Ebru. He nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't lost my son after all. I'd just been waiting for him to find his way home again. That night, as I turned off the lights and looked around my quiet kitchen, I thought of all the things that had been said, and all the things that didn't need to be said anymore. Ebru. The world hadn't changed much. The house was still old, the faucet still dripped, and the same photo of Daniel in his graduation gown still hung by the fridge. But I had changed. Ebru. I had learned that dignity doesn't mean silence, and forgiveness doesn't mean weakness. Shibri. Sometimes it's sim. Ply means knowing who you are, even when others forget.